Hello friends and neighbors, my name is Ray Harwood. I'm with the Rio Crossing Homeowners Association. I've put together this video to explain what a reserve fund is and what a reserve study is. So come on over, let's take a look. Okay, what we have here is a reserve analysis report, and this is what we often refer to as the reserve study. You know that we collect assessments every quarter, and that money goes into an operating fund, and we have that operating fund. It's basically a checking account, and that's where we pay the landscapers, the people who do the tot lot cleaning, the management company, and pay for things like social events and things like that. What every HOA should have, and indeed ours does have, is another fund called a reserve fund. That fund is basically there to make sure that we have money on hand to pay for future maintenance as it comes due. A large discussion of how a reserve fund operates and why it operates the way it does is a subject perhaps for another video, but the idea here is that we are putting a certain amount of money into the reserve fund every month, and when major items that are assets of the association, typically on common areas and some areas not necessarily on common areas, but on what's referred to as areas of association responsibility. When those things need maintaining, we have the money available and we don't have to take it out of our checking account. We cannot use the reserve fund to go install capital items, for example. Several years ago, we put up the solar lights along the walkway and at both of the parks. And there was a proposal at the time that we used the reserve fund to pay for that. And basically we did some research, and our CC&Rs and bylaws prevent us from doing that unless we have the vote of the members first. So let me talk a little bit about the reserve fund a little more while I'm talking about the reserve study. And I'll go quickly through a couple of sections of the reserve study, and I'll spend a little extra time on a couple of sections, but there's a major section in the middle of it that really lists all of the assets of the association. I'm going to put those details over in yet another video, that if you're interested in those details, and it's interesting to see all of the things that we actually own and need to maintain, but I'm not going to put that in as part of this video. So let's get into the reserve analysis report. This is from September of 2019. It says version 4, and that's because we went through several iterations after it was presented to us. You can see the basic cover sheet here. The table of contents has pointers to a couple of things. There's a good bit of information in the preface about reserve funds in general. It's not difficult, it's kind of laid out in layman's terms, but it's worth taking a look at. The executive summary basically tells us a little bit about how this is going to affect Rio Crossing, and then a couple of pages on the distribution of current reserve funds. I won't spend much time on this. Then there's a page 4 there on the projections, which is the go-to chart that your board of directors uses each year in order to help set up the budget and track our spending for the particular year. A couple of pages of other projection charts, and then the annual expenditure detail, which I won't go into great detail, but I'll show you a couple of pages of that to show you what the expenses are projected to be for the next couple of years. And then you can see that component detail from page 14 down to page 66 is something that I'll cover in another video for you, but basically going through all of the assets. We will go back to the index, however, because the index is a very concise couple of page listing of the assets of the association. I'll go through quickly through that as well. So as I mentioned, the preface has some information. You can see the various sections of the preface. I think it's important really to say a couple of things that are here in the introduction. The first of all is that your board of directors, the board of directors of the Rio Crossing Homeowners Association, has what's called a fiduciary duty. Now, fiduciary duty basically means we have to treat this not like it's ours, but like it belongs to the association, because it does. It belongs to the association. It doesn't belong to the board of directors. It belongs to all of us. So the idea is that we have this fiduciary duty to maintain the community in a good state of repair. In other words, in good condition. So we need to keep everything well maintained, but we also can't spend, an inordinate amount of money in order to do that. And so, as I point out in the third paragraph there's a fine line between not enough, just right, and too much. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through some of the rest of the document. Now, this part of the preface really does tell you a little bit more about what the information in the reserve study is. And so if you get back into the reserve study and kind of get lost or can't figure out what it's really trying to say, coming up to the appropriate section of the preface here can help you kind of figure out what it is that's going on. Also, a part of the preface is this glossary of key terms. Each of the terms in here has a specific meaning in the context of homeowners associations and reserve studies. So it's important that you really understand some of these definitions if you're trying to really understand the entire process of reserve study and reserve funding. So here's the first page, really the executive summary, and there's some just identifying information there on the upper left. Keep in mind that this particular study is put together primarily for the year starting 2020. So even though the reserve study was done in 2019, they are sort of assuming that we will continue, and we have continued for 2019 using the prior study. And this really does take effect kind of the 1st of January 2020. And there are 345 homes in Rio Crossing. The information over there on the right, some global parameters, some assumptions. The community profile, there's some information here about the money that was in our reserve fund as of March of 2019 when they started doing the study. In this particular area, the adequacy of reserves as of January 1, basically they anticipate at that point that the reserve fund balance would be $358,000, and a fully funded reserve balance would be $369,000, which gives us a percent funded of 97%. Most associations, believe that you should have your reserve fund funded at 100%, and 100% is the ideal goal. But what reserve planners will tell you is that if you are at least funded to the 70 to 80% level, then you are more than likely adequately set up for the coming 5 years of your reserve fund needs. Information here about what the member contribution should be for 2020, and that 4676 is what we should be transferring over to the reserve fund every month. I did want to point out that the 2020 budget basically allows for a $5,000 a month transfer over to the reserve fund. We felt that our current financial position was good, and that the additional money going over to the reserve fund will make sure we get up to 100% and potentially have some extra money in there to do some of the additional remediation work that we want to do with landscaping and so forth. So you can also see that the 4676 monthly figure amounts to $13.55 a month. The $5,000 that we're putting in each month, according to the budget, is $14.49 a month. So per quarter, about $45 of your $215 assessment is going in to the reserve fund. Here's the section called Distribution of Current Reserve Funds. And the idea here is that these are the things that the current full balance for each of the years would be required. I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time, reading over this particular section. It's interesting, and it does show that, we have money for year 0, which is 2020, for year 1, year 2, year 3, 5, 6. In fact, if you go on down here, there's actually plenty of money in there that would cover all the way through basically 2033. So, even if we never put any more money in there, if something major were to happen now and we couldn't do that for whatever reason, then we would at least have reserve funds available that would cover us that far. But the goal is to continue to put money into the reserves so that, as we continue to look at this over the coming years, the money is going to be there for the future. So that's an important thing for us to look at. Around budget time each year, we take a look at that and sort of recalculate some of these numbers to make sure that we really are properly putting the association in position to take care of future repair and maintenance items. This section on projections is the part that we really do take a look at year by year, what the beginning balance is, what the contribution should be, what interest we would probably get, and then what expenditures are slated to be done for that year. And basically you do the math of the beginning balance plus the contribution plus the interest minus the expenditures gives you what your ending balance is. And then the fully funded balance is a computation over what should be in the fund for all of the current future known expenditures, kind of one cycle's worth, if you will. And so they project there that we'll be at the 93% funded, at the end of 2020. If you'll notice, the beginning balance 358, the ending balance 357. Overall a drop of $1,000, and that's not very bad. If you look at 2021, the beginning balance of 357, which is the ending balance from the prior year, that's the way the accounting works apparently. You see, again, member contribution of $57,000, some interest, some expenditures, a much smaller expenditure at that point. And so the ending balance of 401, it's kind of interesting. You look at that and you go, well, that's almost $50,000 more than the previous one. Why is the percent funded down? It's because the projection then is that there is more money that should be in the fund in order to cover the things, 20 years downstream. And so you'll see that number, fluctuate as you go down the years, between 93%, down as low as 79%, in 2033 and 34. Again, a respectable and acceptable value for the percent funded at that particular point based on the projections. And as we'll see here in a bit, we'll understand why that value actually is a very reasonable value. Here on the next page then is the year-end reserve balance. And so the blue line, as they have down there in the legend, the ideal ending of what would be 100% funded, and then the projected ending of what we believe will be in there if we put in money and expense money as the projection goes. It looks like we will always have, almost or certainly more than $300,000 in the reserve fund at any one particular time. When you get out to 2044, that peak out there in the vicinity of $800,000 is there because the coming years after that require a certain amount of expenditure, which need to be taken into account. And so the goal there is simply to kind of keep an eye on this chart as we go forward and make sure that we certainly don't want it to dip down low, and I would define low as $200,000 would be low, and I would want to make sure that we didn't go below that. You certainly never want this to hit zero, because if it hits zero, that means that you would not potentially have enough money to cover your maintenance. Here's the chart then on the percent funded, and the idea there is that in 2050, which is 30 years from now, we would be 100% funded based on those contributions. So what you end up seeing here is the reserve contribution. So this is an annual reserve contribution, which you can see is in the $60,000 price range now. And as we go out, the amount would increase. That's the projection. And if you remember, back on a previous chart, they talked about the increase in contribution on an annual basis by a percentage. And so that particular value really is designed to sort of keep up with inflation and the fact that prices go up. It's not really to, let's be cheap now and spend more money later. It's just that's the way economies go, and that's the way this particular projection is set up to read. This chart is interesting because it shows the expenditures by year, and you can see that the $57,000 or $8,000 for 2020 is there, and then for the next 4 years the amount to be spent is considerably less. But then in 2025, a significant chunk is basically scheduled according to the reserve study to be repaired or replaced. Now, what we may find out once we get to that point and look at the items that are scheduled to be repaired or replaced then is that their useful life may be such that maintenance can be put off for a few years, or maybe done in a less expensive manner. Again, we look at this projection, and that projection really does tell us how this chart really is put together. So those balances, the expenditures and the contributions all really end up, affecting this particular chart. So then here on page 7, the 2020 fiscal year expenses. The idea is that we should be doing a certain amount of concrete repair and replacement, and we know that we have some curbing around a couple of the park areas, the green belts, that should be, I would say, repaired or replaced. There's some areas where we know we should replace some. The granite replenishment scheduled for another area in 2020, and that amount would need to be allocated for. The irrigation smart link cost, I'll talk about that in a little bit, and some painting of the ramadas and the shade supports and the metal ramada roof. Now, you'll see also down on the 2020 line, the irrigation smart link cost. So for this year, it's $8,040, and next year it is $7,517. In 2017, we knew we were going to have to do some work with our irrigation system, and in 2018, the board voted to install a new irrigation controller system, which basically replaced 6 of the old style controllers that were put in when the community was first built, and we replaced them with 5 controllers. One of those controllers was a 48 port controller, took the place of 2 of the existing controllers, And there were a couple of controllers that are very small out on a couple of the cul-de-sacs that did not have to be replaced at this point. And those are fairly inexpensive. But the reason that we went for this particular SmartLink irrigation system is that this system actually detects leaks in the irrigation system and actually has weather stations built into each of the controllers, so that it can determine the temperature and any rain and actually adjust. And what we've actually seen is a significant amount of water savings. Some of that saving is due to better ongoing repair of the irrigation system, but some of that actually is water savings from the SmartLink system. So that's actually a 3-year purchase. So 2020, a full year, 2019, a full year. We made one payment in 2018, and so in 2021, there's only 11 months worth of payments for that. If we scroll up here, you see for 2021 also another round of possible work on the dry well system, which we had inspected in 2019. We actually have some expenditure that would be in 2019, but actually being pushed out to 2020, but somewhere in that particular area. The Solar King, which is the solar lighting at the playgrounds and the walkways. There's some projection that those batteries would need to be replaced in the 2021 timeframe, and also that the monument signs would need to be painted. So again, the $58,000 expenditure for 2020 becomes a $15,000 expenditure in 2021, and in 2022 only $2,300. So a little bit of additional concrete repair and replacement and painting of the shade supports. And I'm not going to go through this for every year after that, but you can basically see as you scroll down through here, in 2025, it looks like the play structures and some additional granite replacement, some irrigation system component repair and replacement kicks in at that point, and the mailboxes could need some additional replacement or repair. And so that's the year that it ends up being $254,000 potentially in 1 year. And so your board will continue to look at these things and make sure that all of the projections that we've been given by the reserve study folks pans out. So here on page 14, I'm just going to go through one of these, is the component detail. And so you see the block walls, and it basically says placed in service in 08-19. It's because we had the block walls, some repair and some repainting done in the August-September timeframe of 2019. And so they have there the useful life really is 8 years. That means that you're expected to have to repaint that every 8 years. And so, 1 year later in 2020 means you've got a remaining life of 7 years. And so the replacement year would be in 2027. And the expected cost would be in the $25,000 range. They have a future cost of $28,000. So there's an inflation rate built in there to make sure that we are appropriately budgeting for future costs. And there's some other numbers in there that really sort of speak to that at a component level. And then down below, you'll see information that typically a picture, and then some information that the reserve study folks have taken from the board and from previous reserve studies. But then you'll see down here on page 64 and 65, basically a list of all of the things by category and then alphabetically that are part of the association. So this steel split rail fencing I won't go into great explanation here, but it's the stuff that you see sort of painted tan in a couple of areas over the little head wall areas and some of the drainage areas. The Glen Rosa Park, Ramada roof, park equipment, play structure, shade structure fabric. Some more information on the grounds and the irrigation system, the mailboxes, the park equipment, then the lighting from Solar King, paint for the monument sides, shade supports, stuff from Roma Park, some from Sells Park, and stuff from the block walls. So that really is the entire reserve study in a nutshell. And again, I'll put together another video with all of the details and how much they cost and what we do to them and what sort of maintenance they typically require. Some of these things require some maintenance out of the operation budget. I'll point out here that the major recurring maintenance that's not just done every year, the things that are done every couple of years, those are the things that go into the reserve fund expenditures, the reserve study. Something like the tot lot areas, which get cleaned up every month. We used to do them once a quarter. Now we have them out there once a month. That's not done out of reserve. That's done out of the operating fund, and sort of normal to do that. So if you have any questions, most of you know how to reach out to me. I can certainly answer questions. If a bunch of you wanted to get together and maybe have a little session to kind of go over it in more detail, I'm happy to do that. So, thank you for hanging in with me this far. The reserve study is important to the association, and the more you understand about it, the more you'll understand about how the association operates and works to everybody's benefit. Again, I'm Ray Harwood for the Rio Crossing Homeowners Association. Thanks for listening.